Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. The story of food in the United States, as with many of the origin stories of this country, is tied to migration, enslavement, and colonization. It's also filled with generous helpings of resilience, essential dishes passed down through generations, and delicious adaptation. Culinary historian Dr. Jessica B. Harris is with us today to talk about all of this and her new book, Braided Heritage, Recipes and Stories on the Origin of American Cuisine. Dr. Harris is the author, editor, and translator of 17 books, including High on the Hog, a culinary journey from Africa to America, which was adapted into a Netflix series. She's worked as a journalist, travel editor, and English professor, and she served as the culinary consultant for the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture and their acclaimed restaurant, the Sweet Home Cafe. In her new book, Braided Heritage, she examines and uplifts the stories of three cultures, Native American, African, and European, and discusses how their foodways intertwine, influence one another, and continue to transform and evolve with each generation. Jessica, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here. So, in the introduction to your book, you mentioned that you were contemplating how to define the foundational cultures in America, which led you to remember a Schoolhouse Rock song, Three is a Magic Number. And those contemplations and curiosity got you to the idea of the braid in Braided Heritage. When you mentioned Schoolhouse Rock and that song, it reminded me that there was another Schoolhouse Rock song, which maybe didn't age as well as some of the math episodes. That one was called The Great American Melting Pot. And I rewatched it the other night. It kind of reminded me why that concept has been abandoned. The idea of assimilation doesn't really make as much sense to
Well,
us.
nobody melted.
Yeah, nobody melted. They actually literally were jumping into a pot, which was kind of awkward looking. And so, can you talk about the idea of the braid and how it helped you conceive this new book?
Well, I think, everybody doesn't know. Guys don't necessarily know, although more and more folks are wearing braids nowadays. But in order to create a braid, you have three different strands and you intertwine them, over, under, and so on and so forth, depending on the type of braid. And what you end up with is something that is composed of the three strands but stronger than the three strands and something different from the three strands. So that seemed to me to be the perfect metaphor for the origins of American, in very large quotation marks, culture. And I'm saying origins because it is by no means the only part of American culture. American culture is made up of so many more elements, but the foundational ones, if you will, are the native peoples, particularly the native peoples, well, throughout the country, because they were here, European Americans, and specifically the Spaniards who were here first. St. Augustine is older than Jamestown or Plymouth. The British, the Dutch, whom we always forget, but who had a large swath of the middle Atlantic states, and the French, who surprisingly were last in, if you will. And then, of course, enslaved Africans, you know, kidnapped and enslaved. People tend today to be saying things like, you can't be an immigrant on stolen land. So I'm thinking of having a t-shirt made that says stolen person on stolen land, and we'll see how that goes. But the bottom line is, I looked around and said, okay, you've got friends from all of those aspects of the braid. Why don't you get some recipes from them and see what we're talking about? And that's kind of the genesis of the book.
Can you walk us through the structure of the cookbook and a little bit about what we'll find inside?
Well, I mean, it's divided pretty much just as I reamed it out before. There are 3 parts, which makes me think of a joke that a dear friend told me about somebody who was being obnoxious, and he quoted Caesar and said, "All Gaul is divided into 3 parts except yours." But in this case, the book is divided into 3 parts: Native American, European American, and African American, and if you look at the book closely, you'll notice that each section has a slightly different colorway to it. So that's the point that I'm making, those 3 strands of the braid.
Hmm. And we have both recipes and stories. And those stories are guided in a way by your collaborators, which they add kind of a powerful element to the book. While the book is all written in your voice, they're there as cooks and their ancestors are there as well, breaking apart any misconception of monolithic cooking culture. Since it seems like each cook's approach to what we might consider a classic recipe is different. Can you talk a little bit more about your decision to work with these friends and collaborators?
Well, I certainly thought that they would bring, it's not a word that I tend to use when talking about food, but an authenticity. I mean, it is their food that they are talking about that I am presenting and weaving into this braid. And so, in that sense, they are the bedrock. They are the ones. I've got everything from professional chefs to talented home cooks to myself. So, food historian, and also Lenny Sorensen is a food historian. So, there is a wide range of different levels of folks. There's Melissa Guerra, who is a food, I guess, for want of a term, blogger. She posts on Facebook and Instagram. There is Chef Sean Sherman, who calls himself the sous chef, spelled Sioux. And they're just, any number of and a range of people.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you just said about authenticity? You said you don't usually use the word authenticity with respect to food.
Well, I mean, because it makes it absolute, and I don't think food has absolutes. I think that food is more wide-ranging. I think that, fried chicken, I make it one way. Your grandmother, if she made it at all, probably made it a very different way. And the question is, which one is authentic? It's a term that limits, it's a term that distances, and it's not a term that, in my experience of food, really works well with food.
Yep, sorry, you just brought back the memory of my grandmother's fried chicken, which I hadn't thought about in a long time. Uh, she was from Syria, and she would make this big Middle Eastern meal whenever we showed up, but she was also a Midwesterner, and just in case there was not enough food, she'd also have some fried chicken.
There you go. There you go. And she was your grandmother, so it didn't come in a bucket.
That's right. That's right. In the book, you don't diminish the suffering caused by colonialism and enslavement. And at the same time, you've shown and talked about the power and influence that Native Americans and Africans have had on American foodways in the most foundational parts of the American plate and palate. So, I guess I'm wondering to hear in your words about that power and influence because it comes through in the cookbook. For sure, you talk about the foundational parts of the food that we eat that are directly connected to Native Americans and the enslaved Africans. And so I just wanted to hear about that in your own words.
Yeah, no, I think that the whole question of the braid and the people who make up the braid, yes, there is the torturous and often ugly history of the founding of this country, but there is also the country that it became or had become, as well as the fact that we're talking about this through food. And so food is about community. Food is often about connection. Food is about continuity. And so when we're talking about African American dishes that use okra, and there are 3 or 4, I don't remember the exact number, of okra-related recipes. Not all of them just in the African American section. It's interesting to note that this is a food, a vegetable that originates on the African continent, and yet it turns up in the okra soup that Africans prepared, enslaved Africans in many cases prepared in Charleston, and equally in the fried okra that is in the African American section. So it turns up in the British section and it turns up in the African American section. And that to me is part of what's so fascinating about food, and what's fascinating about the braid is the way that we're intertwined. Some people look at the cover of the book, and the cover of the book has a ham on it and then some fried okra. Well, the cover of the book looks like Sunday dinner to a lot of people, but it's also an expression of that power of three. Pigs were brought by the Spaniards. There were no pigs here prior to contact with Europeans. And then okra was brought by the Africans, or certainly brought for the Africans, if not by the Africans themselves. And the corn was here. So you've got the cornmeal breading the okra that's sitting next to the pig. And there you go. That's the braid on a plate or on the dinner table.
Yes, I was thinking about the repetition of those ingredients throughout the book, and the other one that stood out to me, that repeated itself as much as corn and pork was rice.
Yeah.
Well, I was just curious if that inclusion and repetition happened organically or if it was something that you sought out.
No, it wasn't something I sought out. It's just, rice is a staple. And for many people, more of a staple starch than potatoes. And so the fact that so many dishes include rice speak to a variety of things. Had there been a Midwestern focus, it might have had more potato. But because we're talking about those foundational peoples, they came from, well, the Spaniards got their rice from the Moors, who were from North Africa. Um, the Africans, certainly those from Senegambia, have their own native rice. The African continent has its own rice. It's called Oryza glabirima, as opposed to Oryza sativa, which is the rice we are more familiar with. The enslaved Africans in the Carolinas were actually kidnapped and brought to the Carolinas to work in the rice fields. And so it was the African agricultural know-how that produced the wealth of Charleston, the wealth of the Low Country, and the, if you will, end result of that is the Gullah Geechee culture, the Geechee Gullah culture, the whole culture, culinary, and just basic bedrock culture of that Carolina, Georgia Low Country that is a result of many of those rice growing areas in Western Africa. So rice is very definitely a part of the equation.
The book is mostly because it's talking about, early years of this country. It's coastal for the most part. Have you found that did rice migrate with people? Or like you said, if this had been a more Midwestern or Western book, would rice not have been less of the story?
Well, I mean, I think rice, well, first of all, the book is about the origins. And even though we may find that today, the country looks west, at its origin, it was coming in from the east. I mean, unless you want to talk about the possibility of Polynesian longboats and also, I mean, there are all sorts of other possible scenarios, but the one that's most widely accepted is about, you know, the Spaniards, the British, and first contact being in the Florida area, then in what is now the Southwest, the British in Virginia area and what is now, well, actually, the vineyard, the Wampanoag of Martha's Vineyard, are people of first contact. The Shinnecock of Eastern Long Island are people of first contact. The Middle Atlantic, I didn't necessarily cover, but it's not a history book, it's a cookbook. And so the conceit was to deal with those people that I knew. And so there is Julie Vanderhoop, who is a Wampanoag, people of first contact out of Plymouth. Renee Hunter, who is a Shinnecock, people of first contact out of Eastern Long Island. John Barbary, who is Tunica Biloxi, who is out of the Gulf Coast. And then Sean Sherman, who is a Okalaga Lakota Sioux, and he is that whole swath of the country from Minnesota all the way pretty much down to Mexico. And so those were the people that I knew, and those were the people that got chosen. There was, you know, uh, lots of possibilities, but that's the one that seemed to make sense for what I was talking about.
And you say it's not a history book, but there's a lot of history that sweetens and seasons a lot of these recipes, and I found it fascinating to read cover to cover because I'm a cookbook nerd. But I can imagine that people might drop in to different parts as well and, stumble upon your sidebar about watermelon or a top note that discusses the family origin story of a given recipe. Was that part of the book's design, thinking about how readers might be approaching it?
Well, I've always done books with lengthy headnotes. In fact, the genesis of High on the Hog is the result of an editor looking at my previous cookbooks and going, I think you can write narrative. The headnotes got longer and longer and longer. So there will always be headnotes because that put the headnotes place the recipe per se into context. Because it is a book about the history of this food, the origins, if you will, then there needed to be a little background. I spent 50 years, that would be 50, teaching at Queens College, CUNY, part of the City University of New York. I initially taught French, but for the final 47, 43, I guess, of them, I taught English. And so I know about how much history folks know, and it's not a lot. So there needed to be some kind of context into which this braid was set. And so the idea was to give enough history. It's not a history lesson, but it's an overview. And for those who know history, it's a reminder. For those who don't know history, it's a starting point. And then the idea is with that to then have pull out things. I mean, I think that there are ingredients that are fascinating. Watermelon certainly being one of them. I think things like powwows, we hear the word powwow applied to native peoples. What does it mean? What does it come from? I think those are called kind of sidebars, and the book is full of them. Each each thread in the braid has its own sidebars. I wanted to have at least one on a holiday of some sort or some kind of celebration where there would be food. I wanted to have one about an ingredient and then one about possibly, I don't even know. There were just such a wide range and such a large area to choose from. But I mean, I think that the sidebars are always those little add-ons that make people go, "Oh, I didn't know that," or "Oh, wow, never thought of it that way." So that's kind of what they do.
So, you've been a culinary historian, as you mentioned, for many decades, and you have deep knowledge about American cuisine. So, I'm wondering, did you have any surprises as you were working on this book?
Oh, yeah, there are always surprises. There are always surprises. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised in speaking with Melissa Guerra, who is the person who speaks of the Spanish traditions. She is out of Texas, is an, I think, seventh or eighth generation Texan, and was born on the border, what she calls the Wild Horse Desert. And she was born on the border in an area where the border, and at a point in time when the border was very permeable. Her husband, whom I've also met, is Mexican, but they were born in the same hospital. So that there was that kind of back and forth. They could and did go to Mexico for lunch. They came, to Texas for other things. But the thing is that the family's food, as Melissa recounts it, is absolutely parallel, but often there are specificities. I've forgotten which family, it's either her family or her husband's family, who does corn tortillas as opposed to wheat tortillas. And then another thing that they don't agree on is cumin. One family loves it, one family hates it. So there's all of that. I mean, as far as the Dutch, I think the thing that was mind-boggling for me is A, how we always forget them, and yet they've brought us, and when I say Dutch, I'm really talking about the Low Countries, so the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, but how they brought us cookies and waffles. And the one that blew me out of the water, coleslaw.
Right.
Coleslaw is actually cool cabbage salad. So those are some things that were big surprises.
I went on a little deep dive after I read that in your book and realized that the call in collard is the same root
Right.
because,
Well, collards are Northern European greens.
yeah.
They're not African at all, even though people have thought of them as African. They're Northern European greens. Collard is a corruption of colewort, and colewort is any non-heading cabbage.
Yeah, the Dutch thing was really interesting to me. I grew up in central New York, and there's probably some influence on our cuisine there, but it's so under the radar. I mean, we all eat pizza, but we know that it's Italian, but waffles, donuts, the word for cookie, all of that, been disconnected from those roots.
Exactly. Exactly.
So there is one recipe contributor who stood out to me because his dishes don't have the same seasoning or influence from other cultures. You've mentioned him already, and that's Sean Sherman, the sous chef. Can you talk about his project using only ingredients that were available pre first contact and tell us about his part in Braided Heritage?
Well, he's one of the people with whom I spoke, and he is a friend. In fact, I just had lunch with him last week at Owamni. Owamni. And his he trained as a chef, professional chef, went through all of the stuff, burned out, and ended up in Mexico. Where he has a culinary epiphany about traditional foods and looking at traditional foods and how they happen and what goes on with it. Um, but he realizes that there is so much of the food that is traditional to his people that is food of contact, food that results from the contact with Europeans, arguably with Africans, but mainly with Europeans. And so what he does is in his food, he removes all that would not have been there had it not been for contact. So there is no pork, there is no beef, there is no wheat, there is no sugar, and yet his not yet, and his cuisine is extraordinary because you don't miss any of those things, and you get a richness and a lushness that has to do with the way it might have been.
Can you take us to Charleston and the British section of the book?
Oh, well, actually, my friend in Charleston is a person named Kit Bennett, who is 2N2T Bennett, and that means something in Charleston. If you've ever been to Charleston, at the end of the market, there is the facade of a former rice mill. It is the Bennett Rice Mill. When I met Kit, I asked her how long had she been in Charleston, or her people been in Charleston, and she replied, "Since dirt." Not quite that long, but her family was one of the kind of land grant families. And so one of the things that happens with her is she says, and rightly so, that any people with any kind of claim to gentility, if you will, in Charleston at a certain point in time, had African American cooks. And so they were eating a diet that was certainly inflected by some of the tastes of African Americans, in the sense that my friend Grace Young, who is Chinese, talks about the wok hand, that is to say, the hand of the chef in the dish. If you've ever had anybody cook one of your recipes and then serve it to you, it never quite tastes like what it is when you make it. And so that's the wok hand, the hand of the cook in the dish. But if you can assume that for all of those Charlestonians, the wok hand of Africa was there in the dish, you see how those tastes may change. There's also a direct line of what evolution, if you will, between the Chebujen of Senegal, the Jollof rice of Ghana and Nigeria, and Charleston's red rice. Um, Charleston has an okra soup. It's one of the recipes in the book, and certainly the okra tells all the story that it needs to tell. So you've got all of those things happening with the British.
Do you have a favorite dish in Charleston?
I like red rice. I'm not sure. Never thought about it. I like Country Captain, but that's telling a slightly different story.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, it's not in the book.
That's okay.
It's a recipe that talks pretty much about how Charlestonians were seafarers, and so it has curry, and
Mm.
it speaks of another kind of Charleston. So that would be one of them.
So let's travel again to another city. New Orleans is a special place in the book because it shows up in each section. And I had to double back and make sure I was right about that. Can you talk about why it's such an important confluence in our culinary history?
Well, I'm not sure that was even intended. It happens to be that I have a house in New Orleans, and so I know people in New Orleans, and that may be why it shows up three times. But it is certainly culinarily a very important spot because it has a uniqueness in, I guess, American culinary history because unlike much of the rest of the region, and the question really is New Orleans the South? And I contend yes, but because as they did probably, I guess, in the 70s or 80s, people in New Orleans had t-shirts that said the South is north of here. Culturally and arguably culinarily, New Orleans is the northernmost point in the Caribbean. It doesn't fit in with the American South. So it's a very different kind of food, a very different kind of set of influences, and a very different culture, which is part of the fascination of the city.
And maybe not every city that we talk about would have all three of those braids coming together there. Have you found that in New Orleans they've evolved in a different way because of that Caribbean-ness?
Well, I think yes, but I think that many East Coast cities do have all parts of the braids coming together. You don't necessarily see the Native American as strongly in Charleston, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
Hmm.
You don't necessarily see it in New York, but you find dishes like succotash in the South, and that is not only a Narragansett word, but a dish that's based out of Native American, you know, cuisine. So that you've got all of those things. I mean, in New Orleans, it may be like many things in New Orleans, more front and center, but it's the fact that first of all, remember we said the French were last in the braid as far as Europeans go. So that there's another idea of things being a little more recent, not necessarily as, distant in memory, so people can see things and how they evolved a little more clearly, perhaps.
Hmm. I loved all of the linguistic elements in the book. I can tell you're a linguist. You're fluent in French and Spanish and maybe other languages we haven't talked about. And I had this curiosity when I was reading when you talk about yams, aka sweet potatoes, not the African yams, in the African American section of the book, you talked about the meaning of the word or the word yam, from which yam comes, and how it meant to taste. And then it got me wondering, does the word, our slang word yum, does that come from the same root as yam?
Oh, I have absolutely no idea. That had never occurred to me. No. I don't know. It might. I mean, I think the thing is that I really don't know. So, it would be idle speculation on my part to say anything. But I mean, I think that certainly in the Gullah Geechee dialect, for want of a better way of saying it. Food for yam, and it's the same thing in Jamaica. Food for yam. Yam means eat. Yam your food. Eat your food. So there is that. I'm not sure that yum comes from that, but there is certainly enough richness around the word yam to make it worthy of thought. I just don't know. Hadn't thought of that.
Okay, one more question before we wind down. You've traveled so extensively and have deep knowledge of many cultures and cuisine. So I'm wondering, where does your curiosity lead you these days? What's something you're hoping to study or learn about in the future?
Oh, good Lord. I don't know. I seem to be endlessly curious about all kinds of things. So I am, oh goodness. I was in China about 3 years ago, and I was fascinated by the fact that my first meal in China was watermelon, okra, or contained watermelon, okra, and was barbecue. Very, very different, but very astounding. I mean, I was jet lagged beyond imagining, got off a plane, was in the hotel, went down to get to the restaurant before it closed, and there it was, you know, okra. I had no idea it was in China in use. Watermelon. When I taught English, I would often ask my students what was the fruit of their youth and to write an essay about that. And one of the things that I found my Chinese students came up with often was watermelon. That shocked me too. Um, and the barbecue wasn't pig, it was duck, but it was all of those things that we in the States connect so vividly with African Americans being served organically in China. So that's something that fascinates me. I'm fascinated by, what happened to the African diaspora when it went east as opposed to west. We don't look at the African influences, although they are probably there on the food of the Arabian Peninsula, on the foods of the Indian subcontinent, and so on and so forth. How did those worlds come together? I think those things are quite fascinating to me. There's a lot of stuff. I'm basically a nosy broad, and so I'm curious about a lot of things.
I'm sure you'll eat well along the way as well.
Hope to.
Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Amy.
We've been speaking with Dr. Jessica B. Harris, culinary historian and author of Braided Heritage. Thank you for joining us today at Eat, Drink, Think. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.